Okay, this is our set of notes on roots and stems. We're starting to look at the specialized, like the main organs of plants. Okay, originally this was going to be roots, stems, and leaves, but that ended up being a little bit too long. So we're just going to do roots and stems today and do leaves another day. A couple of reminders. Audio, you should make sure that you're listening with headphones. There are a couple of slides where there isn't really much written on the slide, but you should definitely write down things that are being said that you don't see on there that I'm emphasizing, okay? Also, fill in the handout as you go. You should have gotten that handout when you came in, and hopefully I left enough space in terms of margins, like sides of the slides, but if you run out of room, you can always jot things down on the notebook page that you're going to be taping this into. By the way, remember this is going into your lecture notebook, not your classwork notebook. It's going behind the last set of notes that we did on the different types of tissues. Okay, let's get started. So in the readings that you guys have been doing over these past couple days, one of the readings was on the different types of roots that plants can have. And so they tend to fall into two main categories. So the first are taproots, like you can see on the left here. Taproots, just by visually comparing, you can see that they are longer and thicker, okay? They're the kind of roots that you would find in dicot plants. Okay, so they're longer, much longer and thicker than the other type. In fact, with the other type, the plant is everything. That's actually part of the plant, like the stem. And then right here is where the roots begin. So definitely much longer. And so some examples of taproots would be like hickory trees or oak trees. A lot of large trees fall under this category. Carrots, like the one you see here. Dandelions fall under this group as well. And so you even have like some vegetables like beets and radishes fall under this group as well. Okay, fibrous roots, the other category, are the kind of roots that you'd find in monocots. And so as you can see by comparison, no single root in this group is larger than the other, and that's very different from taproots. In fact, this carrot has kind of been cleaned up quite a bit because usually you have this main taproot, and then a lot of times there are smaller kind of hair-like roots that come off of it. There's even a little bit of a tail here from one of them. But usually there are little, very, very fine roots that are coming off of this main taproot, and that's not the case with fibrous roots. None of them are bigger than the other. Okay, so lots of thin hair-like kind of roots. And some examples would be like this green onion. A lot of grasses kind of fall into this category. Yeah, so anything that has this wide kind of clump of hair-like roots falls under the fibrous root category. Okay, now I want us to stop and think, and you can add this in. I don't think I have anything typed on this slide, but stop and think of the benefits of taproots and fibrous roots. So think about the way that their structure is tied to their function. Okay, so taproots, because they're longer, one thing that I would jot down here, one advantage that they have is that taproots, because they're longer, they can access much deeper water. And in fact, a lot of trees like hickory and oak trees that were the examples listed, ironwood here, we have ironwood trees, they have taproots that can go down a couple of meters actually to reach deep groundwater. So the fact that taproots are really long actually is a big benefit because they can get to lower levels of soil where there's a lot of water. Another thing as well that's a benefit of taproots, just like you could see with this carrot, is because they're thicker, a lot of times they end up acting as a storage for things like sugars and starches, and that storage of food for the plant. So that's also a benefit. Okay. Now for fibrous roots, think about the fact that you have all of these roots that are thin and have a lot of surface area, because their job is to absorb water, that actually is very advantageous. The more surface area, and I would jot that down here, the more surface area that you have, that means the greater ability to absorb water. So fibrous roots are really helpful to absorb a large amount of water in the soil that's in them. So you can find fibrous roots on plants that, need a lot of plants that are in areas where there's a lot of surface water, like in the top layers of soil. These fibrous roots kind of spread out and cover more of that area and can absorb water in a wider surface, wider area. Another thing as well is these roots, these hair-like roots, are really good at holding soil, and they actually help with preventing erosion. So you can find a lot of fibrous roots in places that, if you have plants that are in kind of sandy soil or loose kind of soil that can easily be blown away by the wind, fibrous roots are very advantageous. They can prevent that soil from eroding away. Okay, so that's 2 benefits for tap roots and 2 benefits for fibrous roots. Make sure you add those in. All right, so here is a typical root, and let's kind of point out some of these structures. Now, I know I have the things labeled here, but you might want to either add lines, like label lines to them, or you could number these off and kind of point them out here. So I'll just kind of go through this here. So the outer layer, what you see in beige here, the outermost beige layer, that is the epidermis. Okay, so that darker beige kind of color that forms a single layer. Remember, it's dermal tissue, so it's a single layer of epidermal cells. And then some of these cells have extensions, and these are root hair cells. So some of the cells actually have, like you can see right here, this has an extension, and that is, like I mentioned in a previous, I think the last set of notes, these are modified to increase surface area and help with absorption. So that's, some of these cells can absorb a lot more because they have a lot more cell membrane surface. Okay, so that's the outer layer. Then you have what you see in blue here, light blue. That's the cortex, which is a type of ground tissue. Okay, then you have the endodermis, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. It has a lot to do with the root being able to take in water as effectively as it does. Okay, but that endodermis has a unique characteristic, something called a Casparian strip. So with Casparian strip, there isn't really a place to label on here, though I would kind of lump it in with this endodermis, this other beige layer. The Casparian strip is found there. Okay, then you have the vascular cylinder, which is actually everything inside of that Casparian strip, inside of that endodermis. So it's a cylinder. It's a cylinder on the inside of the root, kind of like a core of the root, and in that you would find the xylem and the phloem. So I know it's kind of it's not labeled here, but the purple is the xylem. Xylem tends to be in the very middle, with dicots like this, and then the dark blue is actually the phloem. Okay, the root cap is this lighter beige tip that you see at the end of this root, and that root cap is very helpful for protecting this area right here, which is called the apical meristem. Okay, so remember, meristematic tissue is where growth will happen, and so that's where, like, these cells will divide rapidly and cause this root to get longer and longer. Well, as the root is growing through the soil, it's going to be rubbing up against the soil. There's particulate in that soil, sand, maybe tiny bits of rock and things like that could be damaging to this apical meristem. So this root cap acts as like a protective cap for the apical meristem, so these cells don't get damaged, and the root can grow quite easily through the soil. Okay, so some main functions of roots. Obviously, that root is the only thing that's holding the plant into the soil. So, like this tree that has been pushed over by wind, I assume. Okay, so roots are a huge anchor, our main anchor for a plant, so it stays in its soil. And then also, it's a way to absorb nutrients from that soil. So, nutrients include a lot of elements that we're going to talk about, things like phosphorus and nitrogen and so on, but also water is a major nutrient. So roots play the main role in absorbing water for the plant. Okay, so in the readings, it talks about how soil, the type, if you've ever dug in a garden, you'll find that, or dug any sort of soil, you would know that there are different types of soil. It kind of depends where you live. Like in Sedona, we have really red kind of soil because there's a lot of things like iron and other trace elements in that, versus soil that would be found even down here in the valley. Okay, and the type of soil, like whether it's sandy soil or very clay heavy soil, the type of soil is going to ultimately determine what type of plants will grow in that soil. Okay, so the kind of plants that you'd find in areas of the world where the soil is very sandy and very loose will be very different than the kind of plants you'd find in areas that have soil that is very heavy and hard to shovel, like clay heavy soils. Okay, so, and that has a large thing to do with the way that the roots would be able to take in the nutrients that they need. So some of these nutrients that we should kind of note down here, oxygen and carbon dioxide, they are requirements for a plant, but they don't come in through the roots. I should make a note of that. These we'll talk about more when we talk about the leaf structures, okay? But nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, these are all essential nutrients that need to be absorbed from the soil to help the plant stay healthy. And in fact, a lot of times you can see if a certain plant is missing some of these, they take on, you can kind of see them in their leaves. Like for example, nitrogen has a large role in the color, the green kind of color of plants. And so without nitrogen or in nitrogen poor soils, plants start to get a little yellow. Their leaves kind of get pale because of all the lack of pigment and so on. So a lot of times we might do things like add fertilizer, which is just a way of compensating for any poor quality of soil that you might have. If there's missing nitrogen or phosphorus, we can add those in by things like fertilizer. There are also certain trace elements that can be found in soil as well. Sulfur, iron, zinc, things like that. Large amounts of these can be harmful, but depending on the plant, sometimes very trace elements are not going to be a problem. Okay, so lastly, we just want to talk about how roots take up water. So we could get into a large, complicated explanation. If you want more details about it, page 587, 588 of the textbook goes into much more detail than I'm going to here. But generally speaking, the way that roots take in water is by using these other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, so on, that are in the soil. Okay, and what they do is they use active transport. So if you remember, it would have been a while back in biology, but there are ways that cells can allow things to get into them, to cross their cell membranes. And there's passive transport and there's active transport. And one of the main differences between the two is the use of energy. So root hair cells are the ones are going to use this process of active transport where they have they kind of spend energy in the form of ATP to pump to pump in things like nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus from the soil, pump those substances into the cell, so actively transport them in. And when they do that, I'll just kind of give you a visual on this diagram here. So imagine all of those substances, things like potassium and nitrogen and phosphorus, they all get, they're all in this outer soil, they get actively pumped into this cell, into this root hair cell. Okay, well, when that happens, now you have a greater concentration of those dissolved substances inside the cell versus outside of the cell. And so what ends up happening is water will, by osmosis, be pulled into that cell as well to try and dilute all those molecules that are now inside of the cell. Okay, so water actually ends up getting sucked into that plant, just like a sponge would suck up water. Okay, so that water then gets pulled in, and then little by little, that water is going to make its way into the center of the root and then go up the plant. Okay, and so if I were to kind of do a little, if right here, if I were to zoom in a bit closer, kind of where this picture is getting cut off here, you'd kind of see something like this. Okay, so these are the outer, this is the outer cortex, the outer ground tissue, just past these dermal cells. Okay, but that water would eventually make its way all the way into the center where this vascular tissue is, and get pulled up the plant. Okay, and it does this because of root pressure. Okay, so remember that I mentioned the endodermis, which is that inner ring in the root, has something called a Casparian strip, and this is this waterproof kind of strip that surrounds the cells that happen to be in this ring, in these endodermis cells. And that Casparian strip basically creates a one direction movement of water. So water can go in, but can't go in the opposite direction and back out again. And that's really important because remember, as water goes into cells, plant cells or animal cells, if water goes into them, they expand. Okay, and so to kind of prevent root cells from swelling and that water not going anywhere, to create this one-way traffic kind of barrier, the water that goes into the root, into the middle of the root, has nowhere else to go but up the plant. And up through the stem and so on. Okay, and so there's a pressure that's caused by all this water being pulled into these cells, and that pressure is called root pressure, and that's what will drive more water going up the plant. Okay, and like I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail with that, but if any of that seems confusing, I do recommend getting to the textbook and reviewing those, page 587 to 588. That's the extent of what I'm going to cover for roots. Okay, let's look at stems real quick. In terms of function, there are a few things that stems do. They are going to be the site where branches, leaves, and flowers come off of. Okay, so they tend to be considered almost like the body of the plant. And so they're going to hold leaves up, especially in an orientation that's going to allow them to be able to do their job, which is photosynthesis. And then not only that, but the stems end up being almost like a highway between the roots and the leaves. So in order for water to get from the roots to the leaves, they have to go through the stems. It has to go through the stems. In the case of the products that are made in photosynthesis, those products like glucose and everything are needed by all the cells of the plants, including the cells that are found in the roots. So those roots can't photosynthesize. They rely very much on the cells, the leaf cells, to be able to make food for them. So stems allow for those substances that are made by photosynthesis to go down to the roots and feed those cells. Okay, now a few structures that I should point out, you'll see terms like node, internode, and bud. These are all just kind of external structures you would see on a typical stem. So nodes are basically where a leaf attaches to the stem. So here's a node, here's another one, there's another one right here, wherever a leaf will attach. There is a gap a lot of the times between two nodes, like you can see here, node and node. So this space in between is called an internode. Okay, and then lastly, you might find, depending on the type of plant, a lot of plants have underdeveloped tissue that will, as this plant grows, may turn into other branches, other stems, or other leaves, but these are called buds. And so, a lot of plants, this is actually going to end up extending to make a secondary branch that will also have leaves and nodes and buds as well as the plant gets bigger. Okay, there are two main types of stem, and we're going to actually differentiate between the two different types because they happen to be for monocots and dicots. Okay, so on the left, this is a very typical cross-section of a monocot stem. And you can see vascular bundles. They kind of look like sesame seeds or chocolate chips in this cookie. Okay, so the chocolate chip cookie, think monocot. I guess that might actually be really helpful to remember. But vascular bundles, I know I don't have it listed on here, but if you look very closely, you can see that they kind of have, there are two different colors that you're seeing. I know it's a little hard to see, but there's red and green. That's because there are two different types of tissue in a vascular bundle. So each bundle actually has a little bit of phloem and a little bit of xylem. Okay, so all of these have phloem and xylem to allow for two-way traffic, right? Remember, xylem is what's bringing water from the roots up to the plant. Phloem is what's responsible for bringing photosynthesis products like glucose down to the root and down to other parts of the plant. Okay, so monocots have this kind of scattered vascular bundles throughout. If you look at dicots, however, very different. There's this ring that you kind of see, okay? And so all that vascular tissue is not scattered throughout, but forms this ring or this cylinder in a stem, okay? And so what tends to happen is you have xylem more in the middle of that, like the inner part of that ring, and then you have phloem on the outer part of that ring, okay? So water is, for the most part, coming up through the middle part of the plant, of the stem, and the products of photosynthesis are coming down through the phloem, the outer ring. Okay, now you'll see in the very middle there's kind of looks bubbly, lots of large cells with really, seems almost like a lot of empty space. Those are parenchyma cells, so that's ground tissue, and that ground tissue in the center of a dicot stem is called pith. Okay, there is also ground tissue outside of the vascular ring, and it tends to kind of, it's filling in the space between the dermal tissue, which is the outermost ring, and then the vascular bundle. So this ground tissue is called cortex. You can actually see it labeled there. So cortex is outside, pith is inside. Both of those, however, are ground tissue. Okay, now there are two types of ways that stems grow. And so let's kind of go through that real quickly here. So the first type, and the kind of growth that all plants use, whether monocot or dicot, is primary growth. And primary growth is like if you think of the apical meristems, like the meristems at the tips of roots and stems. Primary growth is where new cells are being produced by mitosis at these places, and basically making that stem longer and longer. Okay, so that's the apical meristem is responsible for that. Okay, so all plants use this primary growth. However, some plants also use secondary growth. Okay, so if we're thinking of dicots or any plants that are going to be so conifers do this, and any dicots that are going to be living longer than one growth cycle, that are going to be getting bigger over the course of like more than a single growing cycle, would use this secondary growth. And secondary growth is where a stem will actually grow wider, and there are things called lateral meristems. And so what secondary growth does is it makes stems wider so that they can support more weight, okay, because that plant's going to be growing bigger since it's living for a lot longer. Okay, now there are two kind of types of lateral meristems that we'll talk about. There's vascular cambium, and then there's cork cambium. I don't know if it's cambium or cambium. I learned it as cambium, so we'll say that. Vascular and cork cambium. So we'll talk about what each of these two do, and that should finish up our notes. Okay, so vascular cambium is found between the xylem and phloem. So I know I don't have it labeled on here, I just realized now, but let's say this is a younger cross-section of a dicot plant, okay? So in the darker red would be xylem. The brownish kind of color structures you see here are, these are xylem, and these are phloem. Oh my goodness, sorry. In any case, so you have xylem and phloem. Remember, they form this ring. Even though this has been cut away, they would form a ring, right? And then, this is ground tissue, this is ground tissue, there's the dermal tissue, okay? So vascular cambium lies between the xylem and phloem, okay? And so as this plant gets bigger, what's going to happen is more xylem and phloem are grown on either side of that vascular cambium. So that was the primary phloem that was first made when this plant was young. But as it gets older, more and more phloem is grown underneath that primary phloem, or kind of like deeper to that. And then on the other side of the vascular cambium, you have more xylem being produced. So technically, it gets wider. It kind of grows, like more xylem grows in this direction, and more phloem grows in that direction. And so over time, this whole stem is going to get wider and wider. So the oldest xylem will be towards the middle. The oldest phloem will be towards the outside, if that makes sense. And then the youngest xylem and phloem is going to be the layers that are closest to this vascular cambium. Okay, so they'll divide the cells in this vascular cambium are going to divide to make more and more xylem and phloem cells. And you can actually see it here a lot of times on like if we were to look at a cross section of a trunk, a tree trunk or something like that, which is a dicot, you would see a lot of times that's kind of where the bark meets the rest of the wood. But we'll look in more detail about what those different layers are. It's not as simple as that. This is a much more kind of distinct, this is a much more easily understandable diagram just because it's all color-coded than looking at this here, okay? But that's what vascular cambium does, okay? Speaking of which, let's talk a little bit more about what we would see with trees. The formation of wood is essentially what's caused by this vascular cambium, what you're seeing here. Okay, so wood that you would see in a tree trunk is actually the layers of xylem. Okay, and so year after year, more and more xylem is produced, and ultimately causes this tree trunk to get wider and wider. Now there are different types of xylem, and you can actually see it very clearly on this diagram. Notice how there are different colors. It kind of gets darker towards the middle and then lighter towards the outside, right? So the darker areas here and all the way up to kind of where this line is, that's what we call heartwood, and that's really just the older xylem. It's so old, in fact, that it's no longer doing its job to transport water from the roots up to the plant. So its main job is actually to, it's hard and not dried out, but it's definitely drier than the outer layers. And so now it's actually a bit more sturdy, and it ends up being a weight support. So it provides structural support for the plant as the plant gets taller. And because it kind of dries out at least a little and becomes harder, it ends up getting darker in color, so that's really easy to distinguish from the outer layers. The outer layer is what we call sapwood, so this lighter color, and these cells are the newest xylem layers. So they are specifically, meant for transmitting the water up from the roots to the rest of the plant. So that's where you would find sap, and that's essentially what sap is. It's water, it's fluid coming from the roots up to the rest of the plant. Okay, if you consider all the tissues outside of the vascular cambium, so vascular cambium would be like this line that you see here. Everything outside of that is bark. Okay, and so it seems like it's a solid single layer, but there's actually a couple of layers there. There's phloem, there's something called cork cambium, and then there's cork, which is the outermost layer. And one of the main benefits is that this cork is waterproof. It's a protective layer. It often has a lot of fats and oils or waxes in it, so it helps prevent water loss. Okay, but if you think about the way that, I'm going to go back here a little bit. If you think about the way that this is growing, if this xylem is getting wider and wider, the primary phloem out here, eventually this is being stretched, really stretched as the trunk gets wider. And so over time, a lot of times you'll see this outer bark layer gets cracked. And that's how, why bark looks the way that it does. It's because these are older layers of phloem that have been stretched as the tree got bigger and start to crack from that stress. Okay, so to kind of point them out here, here's the vascular cambium in green, right? What you see in orange and gray, that together is bark. So you have the living layer of phloem that's growing from this vascular cambium. That's going to be what transmits nutrients down from the rest of the plant to the roots. But then you also have the periderm, which is what we see in gray. And what that's made of is another type of secondary growth tissue called cork cambium, and that is used to grow cork, which is going to be that protective layer that's going to help prevent water loss and protect all these inner structures. Okay, and I think that's it. Yes, that's it. All right, we're done.